let's do. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In Director Acton's absence, I will be the acting chair today. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, and thank you all for joining us. Only the directors, no public, all good. Also, welcome Director Goddard, alternate director. Mr. Barry.
Yes, Mr. Chair, in front of you is an agenda for today's meeting, and I understand there's a new business item from Director Morrison for consideration.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask that the committee consider adding under new business an item under director compensation.
Okay. Doing a motion to that effect, Mr. Barry?
Yes.
Moved by Director Morrison, seconded by Director Stone. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Thank you. So we will need approval of the agenda as amended.
We've got that.
We just did that.
Perfect. So, Mr. Chair, the adoption of the minutes of the Director Services Select Committee meeting of January 17th.
Okay. Moved by Director Stone, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Thank you. Motion carries. Next, Mr. Barry.
The second set of minutes from the Special Director Services Committee meeting of February 27th. The minutes for adoption.
Moved by Director Marsh. I seen her hand twitch. Seconded by Director Morrison. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion carries. Any business arising?
No business arising.
No public input as there is no public. No delegations. No correspondence. Next, Mr. Barry, under reports.
Under reports, the first report, verbal from the Human Resources Division regarding the UBCM model of code of conduct and examples of various municipal codes of conduct.
Through the chair. At the January 17th meeting of this committee, I was given some direction to collect examples for the committee's consideration when developing a code of conduct for elected officials. And so I have done that, and they are in your agenda package. Notable is that a number of nearby local governments have just adopted this code of conduct and gone through this exercise, including City of Nanaimo and also Municipality of North Cowichan. And so those examples are included. They're close by. They're very recent. I've also included the model code of conduct guide that is provided through the Local Government Management Association. And so a number of the examples in your package will have followed that model quite closely. Some haven't followed it at all. They've done something slightly different. So there's a variety of examples there for you to consider. You will notice that some of them have adopted a code of conduct that looks like a policy, and other ones have adopted them as bylaws. So there are some decisions to make there about where you want this document to sit in terms of, is it a policy or is it a bylaw? And I guess finally, I will say that this is largely an exercise for this committee to decide what they want to include and what they don't want to include. So I'm at your disposal to construct a draft document based on direction from the committee on what aspects they'd like to include. I did make some notes along the way. So as we get under discussion, if you're interested in those notes, I'm happy to share them. So.
Thank you very much. Well, let's put the mic on. Thank you very much. Any discussion on any of the code of conduct ones? I do have a comment, if I may. I think some jurisdictions have implemented that into the oath of office as part of swearing-in ceremonies, so that it is a public document. Once you're sworn in, you also take the code of conduct and sign it in front of the judge or justice or whoever is presiding. So that may be an option to consider. Also, the town of Lake Cowichan has just recently implemented a code of conduct as well, which was part of the swearing-in ceremony at the last council swearing in. So another option perhaps to look at if this committee is interested. Any other comments or direction on the next process? Director Marsh.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I found it hard to compare them on the computer. This is one of the disadvantages I find for, clicking back and forth. So I hadn't noticed what, I'm sorry, Barb, what Ms. Mohan said about policies versus, so I'm not sure, can you give us your notes? Just briefly tell us what you noted about the differences, because I didn't track it down very well.
Sure. Through the chair, I didn't spend actually a lot of time on the pros and cons of it being a bylaw versus a policy. I think as a bylaw, there's a different enforcement options of the document, but maybe Joe could talk about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a real easy one for me to answer. The main difference between the two, the policy you could waive at the meeting. The bylaw you can't. So if you want something that's a little more permanent, harder to change, and certainly not change in the heat of an emotional debate or something like this, go with the bylaw. Because a policy, and we've seen this here sometimes on certain policies, I move that the policy be waived, and if the majority of you want that, it's done. Some of you might say that's a good thing, because then you can waive it.
Start bullying or something.
Thank you, Director Marsh. Any further questions or comments? Director Nicholson?
I found this, like Director Marsh, I found this rather a grind to kind of work through. And in the end, I decided that I liked the City of Maple Ridge's Code of Conduct because it was really simple and it was 2 pages and you got it. Because I actually would never read a long, drawn-out Code of Conduct bylaw or policy. Like it was too tedious. So I think we should really take that into consideration. And I understand the difference between a bylaw and a policy, and I would say one thing about, if it's a policy, then it gives you the opportunity to reflect and refine or evolve the policy more easily than if it's a bylaw. And I certainly could never imagine people putting up their hands and saying, let's put the Code of Conduct aside at a meeting and go for it.
Thank you, Director Nicholson. Anyone else? So I think we've heard we want a succinct either policy or bylaw. Yes, please.
Through the chair, I just would take an opportunity just quickly to go through some of my other notes. I didn't quite fully answer Director Marsh's question. I sort of answered the policy bylaw or referred the policy bylaw question, but I can just quickly show you what I highlighted and what I thought was a point of decision for the committee, and not so much that I have a preference one way or the other for your code of conduct. But if you look at the LGMA guide, one of the things that it talked about in the beginning was don't overlook the importance of the process when developing a code of conduct. So I think by the very nature, the establishment of this committee and the consideration you're giving is part of that. But I would also point out that there are board members not at this table. And of course, the next step is that anything developed here would go there for adoption. But just to make sure that you're aware that process is just as important as the end result. So that's part of it. And then it said make the code of conduct meaningful. And so this is something that boards may choose to refer to the code of conduct at every meeting, for instance. So it's one thing to have a code of conduct and sit it on a shelf and only pull it out if you feel it's been breached. But it's another thing to make it an integral part of every meeting or an integral part of every process that you go through as a board. So I thought that was something worth discussion. There's a piece in here about optional additional policies, and I would say further to Director Nicholson's point, the organization already has a lot of those policies. I'd be happy to bring them to a future meeting or distribute them so that you could look at them and know what's already captured in policies that are defined as applying to all of the CVRD, which would include elected officials. We do have some standards of conduct, some communication policies, et cetera, that you are sort of included in that you may not be fully familiar with in detail. So I can do that. Some of these policies I thought went quite far in terms of prescribing the behavior of elected officials. For instance, the District of Lantzville has a piece where it talks about members shall arrange their private affairs and conduct themselves in a manner that promotes public confidence and will bear close public scrutiny. So I felt like that was very far-reaching in terms of governing an elected official's personal and private life as well, although I realize everybody's sort of on display once they're elected. So to me, that was an interesting piece. There was a lot of commonality in terms of the different topic headings in these policies. I noted that the City of Nanaimo's recently adopted policy was based on the template of LGMA. The City of Port Moody and the City of Lantzville had very similar policies. They weren't entirely based on the LGMA example, but they were very similar to each other. And not a lot of notes after that. So, you know, after going through the first 3 or 4, I found there to be a lot of similarity. And it's really just what is the flavor that you want for your policy that best reflects the character of this board, I guess. I see one note to myself that the municipality of North Cowichan has a little bit more well-developed process for handling complaints, so breaches, complaint handling, and disciplinary action. They've fleshed that out in a little more detail than all the other policies. So yeah, perhaps for good reason or some experience. So I would point you to that as well. And there were some unique pieces in Strathcona as well, the Strathcona Regional District Policy. It went a little further than most on meeting preparations. It mentioned things like cell phones should be turned off during meetings. However, if an urgent matter requires that a director respond to an email during the meeting, the cell phone shall be muted or kept in vibrate. You know, very specific. And then there was other specifics under decorum at meetings. So directors shall not interrupt other speakers, make personal comments or comments not germane to the business of the board, or otherwise disturb a meeting. And meetings should provide an environment for transparent and healthy debate on matters requiring deliberation by the board. So those were pieces that I didn't see in every policy, so I highlighted them. And there was also direction in the Strathcona example on the use of corporate letterhead and some specific things about dealing with staff that were unique to that policy too. So, you know, each one has some unique pieces that may come from that organization's experience. But I also think, given that this might be the first code of conduct, that Director Nicholson's comment about it being succinct and you know, not a document that you're going to hesitate to pick up and look through is really important, and then you can always amend it from there. So that would be what I have to say.
Thank you. I have Director Annie DiNardo next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really think that I would prefer instead of a policy, because I've seen where policies go and a bylaw to me. But I would also like to see the staff's, what the staff one is here at CVRD, so that we can be cohesive and maybe, and see what that says as well, to compare responsibilities there, and so that we're working together on the same page.
Thank you. Director Stone.
Well, thanks for your input, Ms. Mohan, because when I looked at this stuff, you highlighted actually some pieces that I all thought were all good pieces, but that goes sort of at odds, I think, with the short, concise piece. But I think that best practices might highlight the fact that if other regional districts have dealt with specific issues or municipalities have dealt with specific issues that led them to include that in their code, we might want to incorporate those to prevent those same situations from happening at our board. And I was wondering, a couple of things that I picked up sort of separate from that piece was, I think the interesting idea to reaffirm the commitment to the code of conduct, even if it's just on our agendas and it's just an item that we pass through as part of the course, maybe there's not a vote or something, but something that says, you know, on every agenda or something about reaffirming our commitment to our code of conduct, whether it's a bylaw or a policy. It's just a reminder at the beginning of each meeting, like, keep yourself in check. I know I could have used that on 1 or 2 occasions, or 10 or 20. The other piece of it may be whether or not staff would like some kind of a resolution out of this meeting to move something to next steps. So I did have a motion prepared, and I won't put a motion forward, but around the idea of preparing a report based on these best practices. I'm almost highlighting your notes that you've already given to us verbally, and maybe preparing a sample code of conduct for consideration by the committee that we could wordsmith a little bit, not too much, but then move it to the board for a broader discussion based on that. I'm just trying to think of how we zero in on this. I don't want to kick the can too far down the road. We're still at the beginning of the term, and it'd be nice to get something to the board sooner than later from my point of view. So that's just, you know, and we're doing the same process right now at our municipality, so our staff is bringing forward a sample code of conduct, and I'll probably steal some of these examples to throw into the mix late in the game, but they're preparing a report with a sample code of conduct for our council to consider, and I just think that might at least shape the discussion and move things along more rapidly. So I do have a motion that kind of says that, but I would ask Ms. Mohan if what would be appropriate at this point, or?
Yes, through the chair, I am fully prepared to make a sample document for you to then make some final adjustments to or discuss. It's just there was such a wide range of examples and length and breadth and depth and topics that I didn't want to presume anything and create something that looks good to me as a staff person, but I'm not an elected official. So I would appreciate a little bit of direction on what's a good starting place, like one of these, or maybe it's the LGMA example because it's the template that, you know, an association has recommended. But if you give me a starting place, then I'm happy to create a document, and then you can certainly edit it with the, you know, the best of what you see in other documents. If the desire is for it to be short and concise, then I can certainly take that direction when I create a sample document. If it's a bylaw, then that's also important for me to know because I don't have experience writing bylaws, so then it's a different kind of exercise for me in terms of preparing a sample document for you. So some of those criteria are important for me to have at the outset, just so that I have a place to start. And then once that direction's given, then I certainly agree. It's a lot easier to have a sample that you then wordsmith as opposed to picking it all out of the air.
Follow-up, Director Stone?
So just a statement. So this is where I think that the conundrum comes in, that based on my experience anyway, a prepared document at least gives us something to contrast and give input on. I feel like if we try and keep on throwing the things forward that we each individually, I guess my bias would be to deferring towards staff expertise based on what they see in the sample documents as a best practices, and then letting us use the other documents that we have in notes for reference to say, but I would like to see this piece included, or I don't think this piece is necessary. I just think it would shape the discussion. Otherwise, I could see myself, based on these examples that we have, spending a couple of hours just, you know, sort of debating it. Whereas if there's a sample document, I find that gives me some frame for the discussion to maybe make it more concise discussion, but that's just my perspective.
Thank you. Director Marsh?
Thank you. I think that the piece that Ms. Mohan mentioned from North Cowichan about complaints and potential actions against an elected official who gets out of line, I think that if that is somehow put in, it would save a lot of time should there ever be an elected official that required that. And I think, at least in the first draft, I'd like to see it. And I would suggest that Barb talk to Sarah Nixon from North Cowichan. And you can probably talk HR to HR you'll get a lot of insight into, I think, heading off certain kinds of things that could happen at any table. If it starts at the beginning, if you have it right from the beginning, or, you know, I think it's a good thing. Because it
Awesome.
can take an awful lot of time
Yes.
to do it on the fly.
Cause
like
some
years.
tensions and and I think by the examples, it shows that one size doesn't fit all. Your comment about placing this either on the agenda, or I would suggest another possibility would be to put it on the screen as our policy or bylaw, whichever, after the public input policy is displayed as well, just so that not only us, but the public is aware that there is a code of conduct. Director Morrison? Should it be passed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm very encouraged by sort of the tone and tenor of the discussion, and I'm very much in support of giving some points to staff to follow up on and create something from that. I absolutely agree with the idea of it being concise and to the point, and I just want to share a little bit of experience in that the various associations like AVICC is struggling with the code of conduct for the convention. And I've seen code of conducts that you're supposed to read them and then sign at the end before you click the next button on the registration, which you know that people are just going to the end, clicking red and going on to the next. So it's that usable and effective and concise code of conduct that I'd like to see, and short enough that we have a reminder when we sit down. I'm not going to bring up the dreaded placemats, but also for people that come and join us in this chamber that can see that we have a code of conduct. So I'm very supportive of asking Ms. Mohan to take on a drafting exercise of a code of conduct that is concise and to the point. And I think we should also turn our mind to what Director Marsh had brought forward, and I'm reluctant to say let's ensure that we bring in the penalties and if contraventions do occur that are as part of the code of conduct, but I think it is important that we're not doing this as just an exercise that is done at the beginning of the term and then forgotten. I don't know to what extent there are remedies for contraventions of the code of conduct, but they have to be considered. Something that has a code of conduct with no teeth or no consequences, you know, right from raising our kids, that you can talk all you want, but if there isn't a consequence, they can't watch Teletubbies, then you know, they'll continue doing it. So if you get a motion, I'd like to hear it and have us move on to the next item.
I have Director Stone.
So I was just taking some notes that might be helpful, I guess, so considerations, I think, maybe to put a motion forward, but that we should discuss, or how long is it going to be, or do we want something more like Maple Ridges, like a concise, something that's easy to put up on the board? I think that's good instruction. So I guess the next question I would have is it an and/or with a bylaw and a policy, or can you have a bylaw with a supporting policy that has more depth?
Mr. Barry.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I've just been listening. There's a little bit of confusion here. Doesn't matter. And what I say by that is, if you do it by bylaw, you would attach your policy as a schedule.
And then you can amend the policy without amending the bylaw, correct?
No, you'd still have to amend the bylaw, but what is really important for your decision at this point isn't whether it's a bylaw or a policy. Get the document, the code of conduct you want. If you decide to do it as a bylaw, there would be a one-page covering that basically says the attached code of conduct, known as Schedule A, forms this bylaw.
Okay. So then I guess the other questions might be after we get to the discussion of getting close to a finalized policy, which do we include it at the beginning of the meetings? Is it a signed document that all the directors do either separately or as part of their oath of office. Those are all policy things we can decide after we have a code of conduct in place or recommend to the board. So I'm gonna float this and just see if, I do have it written down, Mr. Barry. So my sample motion, if you will, and if it looks right, if I see nodding heads, I'll move it, that would be that staff prepare a report and sample code of conduct. And I said no more than 3 pages, but I think that might even be a little bit much. Based on best practices for consideration by the committee. And I was going to say and forwarding to the board, but I think we'd have to work it before we make any motion that includes board. So I'm not sure if you have enough information though, because that's the original motion I had, but those other questions I had were, so, you know, I'll put it out there, we can amend it, that I would move that staff prepare a report and sample code of conduct no more than 3 pages long, based on best practices for consideration by the committee. Mr. Barry's gonna fix it.
I would just tweak the start, that a report be prepared.
Sorry, this is just my municipal wording coming through again. That a report be prepared, that a report and sample code of conduct be prepared, no more than 3 pages, based on best practices for consideration by the committee.
Okay, it's moved. Do I have a seconder? Okay, thank you, Director Morrison. I have
I'm
a
gonna
speakers
email that
list.
to you, so you can't read my chicken scratch.
I have a speakers list, so I'll continue with that before we go forward. I have Director Goddard. Alternate Director Goddard, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's more curiosity. I'm wondering what would be involved if this document was finalized? Is it something that would be a lot more difficult to go back and add to if we didn't include, or you didn't include, aspects of other communities? Is it, is it more imperative that it is created as a all-encompassing document right off the go?
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just perhaps I'll let Ms. Mohan speak to that question, but I have something that perhaps you might want to consider with respect to that motion. So following Ms. Mohan.
Through the chair to answer the question, certainly it's something that you can start with a short, concise policy and then add to it later if need be. And with respect to the direction that would be given by this motion, I would bring a sample to the next meeting, and then there would be discussion and deliberation and possibly editing at that meeting before it was finalized to be presented to the board. So.
Mr. Blackwell, some additions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So based on what I heard with regard to the question around penalties, you may want to also require in that staff report that the issue of penalties be set out, because there are specific legal parameters that apply to the extent that penalties can apply to, quote, infractions, unquote. And so in the absence of that information, it might influence in a way that's suboptimal where you go with your code of conduct. So I would suggest it's an important bookend to the discussion.
Thank you. Director Marsh.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to what Director Morrison asked, and if and please correct me if I'm not remembering this correctly, Ms. Mohan, but it's trickier to discipline or have punishment for elected people, sadly, with the way they treat each other. I don't know if it's impossible, but certainly there is law under all the things listed in North Cowichan. If an elected person is abusive or bullying towards a staff person, and indeed you have to investigate that, and it's not a cheap process. The third-party lawyer comes in and does that, and then so you get independent advice, not maybe right away, but if it goes that far, and then the avenue that you have is called censure. And you can go up to, I believe, as far as, you can't stop the person from being elected, but you can actually affect their stipend, if you want to go that far. So, but I don't know if there's any way you can stop a person legally if they just continue. But there are censure steps, and you have to go through process along the way, and everything's documented and all that kind of stuff. But I agree with Mr. Blackwell. I think that some way of sort of indicating that might help people realize there can be consequences to certain behaviors. And I would imagine that a chair could speak to an individual counselor or director if there was inappropriate stuff consistently happening at the table. That would probably be one thing to start to document, right? But, I mean, certainly you can remove a person from a meeting, but to remove them permanently, I think it's practically impossible. Yeah.
Yes, Ms. Mohan.
Through the chair to the director, definitely there are limits to what can be done to, as consequences for, bad behavior under a policy or a bylaw. I'd be happy to, as Acting CAO Blackwell has said, I'd be happy to outline those in the report so that you know what's available to you. There certainly are things available to you, though, even within the limits of what the law prescribes. So I noticed with interest the list that's provided in the sample code of conduct from the District of Lanceville, which I believe may have had some requirement to rely on their policy. And it's an interesting list of possibilities. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but there are things like letter of reprimand, requesting that the member issue a letter of apology. Right, and then requirement to attend training, suspension or removal of an appointment as a member, as an acting mayor, or as a chair of a committee, for instance. Restricting the member from attending certain events as a representative, imposing further limits on travel or expenses beyond those set out in policy, requiring the return of property, limiting access to certain facilities. So there is a range of consequences that appear to be available, and then I can certainly confirm which of those are within the discretion of the board and which of those are legal processes in the report that I do.
Okay, thank you. Director Morrison?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, I was thinking that the motion that was on the floor was wholesome and encompassing, and that would be some of the nature of the discussion that would be brought back if we give that direction. So, thank you.
Are you ready for the question? Oh, Director Nicholson.
I just think when I looked at the Maple Ridge one, what I really liked about it was clear that we're talking about when we're working together, our code of conduct, and then when we're working with the public. And I think that distinction is a useful one to, and then an additional section about holding us to account on that, the process for doing that would be useful. But I wouldn't go for too much more. I really have trouble, I have to say again, I really have trouble with these thou shall not. I really like the way it was written in sort of clear, practical language that you could get your head around.
Yeah, I think we're all adults. We don't need an 11th commandment. Director Stone.
Have you seen some of our meetings? Anyway,
I've attended some of your meetings.
I would agree with Director Nicholson's statement. When I had written down samples here, I wrote Maple Ridge and then a little bit of North Cowichan's because I think it had a little more teeth in certain areas, and then just the overall guidance of LGLA, UBCM, and there was that provincial one that the minister sent at the beginning of this term as well, which laid out some practical pieces. So I think with that understanding, if the discussion here can color the motion from staff's perspective and give some guidance, then I think that we're in good shape.
Excellent. So no more hands. I will call the question. All those in favor? You do have one more, Director Marsh. I'm sorry.
I think it would be important to have a bit in your report about conduct on social media, because it can get pretty, and I know we do have in North Cowichan, and I know it's 11 pages long, the whole thing, but I just think now that's important, and even if the board merely wants to say that we need to say, this is my opinion alone, and yeah.
Okay, I won't get into the social media thing, but I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Carries unanimously. Thank you. Moving on, Mr. Barry. Sorry.
Mr. Chair, Thank you. Verbal report from the Human Resources Division regarding elected officials' benefit plan update.
Through the chair, I just wanted to take this opportunity to let you know that I've made an inquiry with our benefits agent about the progress of the establishment of a group for elected officials. So we're almost there. He's had to do considerable work to convince them to accept a March 1st enrollment date. I don't have final confirmation on that, but he sounded hopeful today. If it's not March 1st, it will be an April 1st enrollment. He did forward me some of the enrollment forms already, so you may get an enrollment form in your mailbox or through email in the near future. Some of you already, we have your enrollment details. For the municipal members specifically, will need enrollment details. And yeah, I'm happy to entertain questions if I have the answers.
Director Stone?
That leads perfectly. You're segueing for me. Thanks, Ms. Mohan. So from a municipal perspective, you know, I know the life thing is the baseline requirement to allow group participation, but are the municipal directors eligible to opt in for the full coverage?
Through the chair, yes, they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, comment? Ms. Mohan?
Sorry, further to that, it's actually the reverse is true, which is that opting out of coverage would require you to provide evidence of coverage elsewhere. Yeah. So.
Okay. Look forward to finalization of this for everyone's benefit. Mr. Barry, next.
The new business item from Director Morrison.
Director Morrison, would you like to read that, or would you like Mr. Barry to?
I'd like to read this motion.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Mr.
That
Barry.
a report be prepared outlining various approaches for directors to consider in discussion of elected officials' compensation with a view to making a recommendation to the board prior to the termination of the select committee's mandate.
That has been moved. Is there a seconder for that motion? Director Stone. And discussion, Director Stone?
So within that discussion, would it be, are we looking, because I think there's two issues at play here. One is that if local governments continue to refer to each other's averages and stuff like that, nobody ever deals with the elephant in the room, is that the requirements of the role are, you know, and I don't pretend to understand what electoral area directors go through, but really are essentially full-time positions. I know that the combination of roles that I serve as the mayor of the municipality in itself is a full-time job. I started tracking hours, and I don't think I'm averaging over 50 hours a week into the two roles. So I guess the question becomes, what kind of guidance are we looking for? Are we looking for what, you know, that balance between fair compensation for work performed versus community service that we provide as elected officials as a service to our communities? Of course, local government people are the only people expected to work for below minimum wage to serve their communities in a political sense. Or are we just looking to see what everybody else is doing and do the same old of, oh, what's comparable regional districts doing and electoral areas being compensated? I would contend that every, and we hear this from staff, so I don't want to sound like staff, but every regional district is very different, depending on the priorities of their communities and the work they do. I think that's a really tough analysis to do when you want to compare. You know, I said apples to oranges, and my CAO municipally said, or strawberries to watermelons. There's such a vast difference in size and scope that even a regional district of similar population and geographic conditions, if you will, there's none that exist in BC, but still wouldn't be an apples to apples comparison. So I just wonder if what kind of insight we want to look at. Is this broaching the subject of elected officials are not compensated fairly for the work they do, and the expectations therefore are disconnected with the public's expectations of the amount and quality of work that elected officials do? Or are we just looking to find some kind of baseline comparable to what our neighbors might do?
Thank you, Director Stone. I have Director Morrison next.
That's great and fair comment, and in discussions with Ms. Mohan, it's clear that there will be different approaches to this question. So this motion is crafted to get some baseline information that will be brought back, and then we'll have at her. So it's not in-depth, it's not, the absolute most current comparator, like, that wasn't the intent. The intent is, here's where we're at, what do you want to do with it? And so everything that you just mentioned, I think will be fair game for discussion when this is back on the table. There was no intent to wade into that today. It's just, let's get the baseline report. Hopefully the benefits question will be dealt with, and we can turn our minds to this at our next meeting.
Director Nicholson.
I'm sorry, could you read that motion again, please?
Certainly, through you, Mr. Chair, that a report be prepared outlining various approaches for directors to consider in discussion of elected officials' compensation with a view to making a recommendation to the board prior to the termination of the select committee's mandate.
Follow up?
I'm sorry, I really don't understand what we're trying to do here. I've missed, I've missed this whole thing.
Ms. Mohan.
I might be able to provide a little bit of clarity. So it strikes me that some of the fundamental problems that are encountered by the board when talking about issues of compensation and appropriate compensation for elected officials are parts of compensation philosophy. Like, how do you pay people for what they do? What are the criteria that you use to pay people for what they do? And so as an HR practitioner, there is philosophy behind that, and science behind that, and how that is determined. And I think in order to aid the discussion going forward about what this group is going to use to determine how compensation should be decided, it would be useful to know what the scope of those considerations are from a compensation philosophy perspective. So I would be bringing you things around both what other jurisdictions might do, but also things like various factors like the hours of work that you put in, your status about whether you're actually an employee or you're not under the law, those kinds of considerations, things like degree of training, or because that's something that's commonly used in compensation decisions, not necessarily for elected officials, but there's that. Degree of responsibility, complexity of decision-making, those kinds of factors that typically drive compensation philosophy. So it was thought that there might be some value in you being aware of the scope of that when you're deciding which ones to rely on to make compensation decisions.
Hopefully that clarifies some of your points. Yes. Excellent. Director Stone.
I think Mr. Blackwell wanted to weigh in, but that's...
I'll let him after you.
Is he filling the finance role back there, or what's going on? Sorry, I'll let him finish before I speak, if
Okay,
that's...
Mr. Blackwell, if you'd like to.
I think just to follow up with what Ms. Mohan is saying, one of the challenges you're going to have is the standard metrics won't apply, and it's ultimately going to be a subjective decision based on how you want to acknowledge the role, and you're going to have to realize or appreciate perhaps that there isn't a specific metric around the number of hours. People will work to a different degree. Some will work 20 hours a week, some will work 80 hours a week. Ultimately, this is a judgment call that is going to be weighted, I would suggest, on other factors. Factors such as, what do we have to do to attract a broader segment of society so that they can set aside their standard work week and financially accommodate an elected role? Those are the metrics you're going to have to use, which won't exist in the standard HR realm that Ms. Mohan is speaking to. That said, those are important. That's an important piece too. I just wanted to make sure that the full perspective was considered when you're looking at this question. It's going to be a subjective call at the end of the day.
Thank you. And Ms. Mohan?
So, yes, I do plan on bringing some of those outside considerations that would... Oh, sorry. Those outside considerations that are unique to an elected official, that I would bring those as well to the table for your consideration. So,
Are you ready? Director Marsh.
So I'm not sure, I'm just going to say it. We did this in the last part of last term and increased the stipend And I'm just wondering, I thought we did.
Just the tax thing.
Oh, just the tax thing. Okay. Okay. So that, it was always the intention to dive deeper after that was addressed. Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Director Stone.
Just briefly, I believe the motion at the time was to adjust the compensation based on the tax changes for 2019, but I think we also referred that to the future board to have this deeper discussion.
Excellent. Mr. Black. Oh, okay.
Yeah, just to clarify for the directors, the motion was for the 1/3 that was once expenses. That's why there was the increase that was put into place, and that's the increase that took place for the 2019 year. It wasn't to do with the compensation, it was to make up for that 1/3.
Excellent. Thanks for the clarification. Further discussion? Ready for the question? All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion carries. Thank you. No information, Mr. Barry?
No information items?
No unfinished business?
No unfinished business?
No question period, no public.
Motion to adjourn, Mr. Chair.
Moved by Director Stone, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Thank you very much.